I'm going to be speaking tonight for all of you on a biblical perspective on racism. So we've had a chance to talk about this a little bit with Brother Zach. He spoke last time, and I think we had the start of a good discussion there. I actually gave a sermon about this on Sunday, more on the dialogue part of it. This is somewhat part two of that message, and I realize most of you weren't there for part one, so I'm going to not assume too much. But we had, I thought, a good couple of sessions talking about this, and I'm hoping that this can drive it further in illuminating and edifying directions. So with that, let's go forward. So for tonight, what we're basically going to do is I've laid out the talk in a few different segments. So I'm just going to give an overview and frame the subject first, and then I'm going to give you what I call the structural perspective, and then I'm going to give you what I call the individual autonomy perspective, and then I'm going to try to bring it all together and say what we can do about this. When I was preparing this talk, I thought, oh, it'll be a short talk, and I realized when I was starting to write it that this could actually be multiple hours, and so I actually had to truncate quite a bit some of what I was initially hoping to talk about, but I think I still got the substance of what I was hoping for. So let's start. There's basically, in the modern world, and I'm going to be speaking more from a US-centric perspective here, even though I know there's people on the call from Canada, but I think it's the same situation in Canada as far as I can tell. There's basically two perspectives on this debate, and the perspectives are, on the one side, they're what I call the structuralists. So the structuralists are those who see the main cause of ethnic disparities as being more systemic, institutional, and historical. And there's all these buzzwords you're hearing today about systemic racism and institutional racism. And typically, not always, you see people who are more aligned with the Democratic Party in the US who would fall along these lines, although there's many people who are not, who would still be in that camp. And then on the other side, you have the individualists. And the individualists are those who see the main cause of ethnic disparities as being basically choice. And individual choices, of course, aggregates up to higher order structures, family choices, and beyond. And some individualists will even point to genetics. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that today, although I would like to. I actually initially was going to talk about this. I did my postdoc research in human genetics, and I have a lot of thoughts on the relationship of ethnicity to genetics. And as I said, I published several papers in this field, so I won't get to talk about it tonight. But if you want, you can talk to me face-to-face about my talks and my thoughts on that. All right, so I'm going to first lay out a preliminary thesis. This is not my main thesis, but my preliminary thesis is that both sides have significant elements of truth, but that very few people have carefully studied the subject. That I think you can find a lot of truth in the structuralist position. You can find a lot of truth in the individualist position. But unfortunately, most people are not very well read or very, very well studied on either side, frankly. And instead, both sides keep listening to their own camp. They live in an echo chamber and they reinforce their position. So if you watch Fox News all day long, which I trust that none of us are doing, but you would pretty easily be reinforced in individualist positions. If you're reading the New York Times all day long, then you would get reinforced in the structuralist position there. And then on top of that, people use very polarizing rhetoric. Sometimes it's insulting, but it's at least polarizing. And then you tend to have negative associations of the other side, and the divide deepens further. And unfortunately, this has even crept inside of the church in varying ways. This thesis pertains to the world as a whole, but this thesis certainly has played out in the church, where a lot of churches have agreed to disagree, and they basically said, you vote for Clinton or Trump and Biden, and we're just going to keep it private because if we talk about it, we're just going to get each other terribly upset over the subject. And it's become a very difficult subject for people to discuss. And then finally, there's way too much jargon out there that confuses the issue. I spoke about this on Sunday on the problem of jargon. I'm not going to talk about it much today. I could spend even more time talking about it than I did on Sunday, but the jargon problem is vast. And I listen to most people speak on this, and you hardly know what they're saying, and they say very, very little, and a lot of time It's extremely frustrating. And so what I want us to do is to keep this in mind. There's a principle here that I once heard from a Christian sociologist who I really appreciate, who says that the devil loves to specialize in a letter, and he specializes in the letter D. And that means divide, distort, and devour, or destroy, you could say. And this is his signature. And this whole moment that we're in right now in 2020 is a signature opportunity the devil has used to ramp up these strategies of divide, distort, and devour. And then in contrast, God loves to redeem, reconcile, and restore. So God loves the R's, the devil there loves those D letters. And I'm very acutely aware of the division that this topic can provide, but I actually feel that it should be a subject around which there should be redemption, reconciliation, and restoration. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the very best that I can generate structuralist arguments, and I'm going to give you the very best individualistic arguments. And so this means that everyone probably has an affinity one way or the other, and so you're probably going to really like part of my talk, and you're probably really not going to like the other part, because you're going to say, it's being stated in ways that are uncomfortable or I disagree with. But nonetheless, I want you to hear me out and hopefully give me at least a fair hearing to listen to the best of both positions here before we try to bring them together. So the structuralist argument begins biblically, and it says, hey, look at Matthew 9. When Jesus looks at people, he looks at them with compassion. And why does he look at them with compassion? It says, because they are like sheep without a shepherd. The very term sheep means a being that needs to be led, that's not very autonomous. And sheep, by their very nature, which are all of us, every single one of us in the Bible would be classified as sheep. We are fundamentally products of the structures and people that are over us. And this is something that Jesus himself clearly says here is the basis of his compassion. He looks at people as basically, in some translation, helpless and harassed because they're like sheep without a shepherd. So this is a strong argument. In addition, I don't know if you know this acronym, END9, END9. If you don't know it, you should learn it. END9 stands for Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel. And those three books, in chapter 9, there are prayers of confession and lament. We're not going to have time to look at them. I wish we did. They're really incredible chapters that we should delve into at some point. But they're very interesting because these chapters contain passages where very godly people, and I'll focus on Daniel because that's the best known. Daniel there is a very godly man, one of the most godly in the whole Old Testament, who confesses the sins of Israel that he didn't commit. And he confesses sins that were prior to him that were the basis of the exile. So we all know the story of Daniel, right? He was taken as a young boy into exile, into Babylon. And there he remains for 70 years. The exile's up. In chapter 9, he prays that God would end the exile, end that period of subjugation. And he very interestingly confesses sins that are the sins of the people, that are the sins of the whole. And this is troubling to those who are individualists, that someone here, as righteous as Daniel, is confessing sins that aren't his properly. But he does. They confess the sins of people that they didn't commit. And I think we can embrace that tension. We don't need to run from the tension that most of us, when we think of sin, we in our minds picture that as being basically an individual deed, and it certainly is, and there's dimensions of that. I'm not trying to say that one is right and the other is wrong. I'm trying to say that both are compatible. So there are many other structuralist arguments we could give, but deeply embedded in the structuralist case is the case of history. And I'm going to give just a tour de force here of the history that I think is incredibly important for us to understand and really is very compelling for the structuralist case. So it begins with this triangle called the Middle Passage. So what is the Middle Passage? The Middle Passage refers to the trafficking of goods and people between Europe, the west coast of Africa, and then the regions here in blue. So parts of Latin America, and then the South, and then many of the islands that we would today call the Caribbean, like Jamaica. So basically what would happen was there would be boats that would leave from from Europe, and they would travel down to West Africa, and they would contain textiles. They would contain all kinds of European goods, firearms, interestingly, and they would go there and sell these goods in Africa. And there were various warlords and tribal leaders who in exchange would give them slaves that had been captured from the interior of Africa. Those slaves would then be taken across to this region here and then sold in exchange for either sugar, coffee, or tobacco. Those were the three most prized possessions. And then those goods would then be returned back to Europe, and then the cycle would begin. And every step, people are making profits, and this cycle wound around for a couple of centuries. The Middle Passage was horrific. This is a picture from, a drawing, I should say, from the 1800s of how slaves were trafficked across the Middle Passage. And because this was fundamentally a business that was run, you can imagine the incentive is high volume, get as many people as you can across this, because make no mistake about it, this was purely a monetary endeavor designed to make profits at all costs. Conditions were very unsanitary. People would not be allowed freedom of movement, and so they would have to be sitting there, lying there in their own feces and urine, the feces and urine of others. Diseases would spread. Many, many people died along the Middle Passage. To give you a little bit of a sense, here's an account from an individual who was transported. He came from Nigeria, and he says this: "At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put under deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, which means greed, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs into which children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable." It's difficult to even imagine what it would be like to travel thousands of miles in a ship like that under these conditions. Interestingly, the very first arguments for deregulation in modern history began at this time. So as it turns out, there was an organization called the Royal Africa Company that had a monopoly in England to do this slave trafficking. And as I mentioned, this European desire for sugar, coffee, and tobacco fueled this. And what happened was a bunch of people who were not part of the Royal Africa Company said, you know what, we want in on this too. And this is basically a government monopoly. And it's fascinating to go back. I was listening to a couple weeks ago a lecture on this. Fascinating to go back and listen to the arguments that British sailors were making. They would say, we want our freedom. We want our freedom here, and this means that you, England, have to deregulate this industry. And they eventually were. A man named Richard Harris deregulated the industry and succeeded in 1712. And this just massively amplified the industry, decreased the price of slaves, right? Because now you've got more people that are engaged in the business, and it amplified the trade. An amazing story here of deregulation. One of the things that we have to be very mindful of is how wretched these arguments can be. 12 million slaves were taken through the Middle Passage in these centuries. And look at this, 1.8 million dying en route. So approximately 15% of people just died on the ship. Many people found it so intolerable, they didn't want to eat food. They would rather die by starvation than go who knows where. Of course, they didn't understand the language. Absolutely horrible. I want to point this out. You know, I work in the business world, and I often say this, and people generally don't listen. They roll their eyes when they hear me say this. But be very, very careful of when there are unnaturally cheap prices, because people will turn a blind eye to things and look over all kinds of cruelties and atrocities for the sake of their stomachs. When people want the $3 t-shirts from Walmart and they don't realize that there's tremendous injustice on the other side from the women in Bangladesh that are toiling under horrible conditions so they can get this $3 t-shirt from Walmart. Be very careful. I've talked before about animals and factory farms and how just it's incredible. It's about 99% of animals in the US are raised in these conditions. And Christians, I have found in general, are the happiest to turn blind eyes to these industries. And unfortunately, this has been occurring for centuries. It's nothing new. And I don't know how else to say other than wake up. We got to wake up and see this history. Many Europeans never saw these slaves. They just wanted their sugar, they wanted their coffee, they wanted their tobacco, they wanted it cheap. And they turned a blind eye to horrible, horrible injustices. And my thesis is we still do the same today. So let's wake up and pay attention to this. Okay, on top of this, we go to the middle of the 1800s, and these new arguments begin that smack of inferiority is too weak. They are arguments of inferiority. And if I were to ask you all what was Darwin's most famous book, probably you would say The Origin of Species, right? On the Origin of Species. Well, in fact, that's partly true. But you know, books back then had very long titles, and the full title of Darwin's book is this: On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. How many of you learned that in your high school biology books? Now, I despise Darwinism for many reasons. Some of you have heard my talks against Darwinism. It's scientifically ridiculous. But I hate it as much for what he was doing here in laying out arguments that were seized on at a crucial time here when debates were going on about slavery and colonialization. And Darwin has a separate book called The Descent of Man, where, just to give you a flavor of what he thought, he said, the Western nations of Europe now so immeasurably surpass their former savage progenitors that they stand at the summit of civilization. Elsewhere he writes, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races through the world. We don't have time to talk about this. I could give you easily a 40-minute talk just on this subject, but people grabbed this idea and they justified time and time again the validity of slavery, and as well as the validity of colonizing Africa. This is when most of the colonialization was beginning during this period. So the structuralists who are aware of this, I should say 99% of structuralists are not aware of this, but those who are, look at this and say, this is horrible. Look at this structural setup now that blacks in particular are facing, where they're now looked at as genetically inferior thanks to Darwin and many others. This carries on forward with IQ tests. Even in the 20th century, there was a lot of forced sterilization that happened as a result of IQ tests. Terrible legacy that exists here. So as I said, this proves to be the justification of slavery and colonization. Of course, it's very famous, the stories of physical abuse. Whatever you think of antebellum slavery in the US, you probably don't understand how horrible it was. Like if you think it was this bad, it was actually a lot worse. And if you've done serious reading on the subject and you realize how just viciously the typical, not the unusual, but the typical black slave in America was treated, or in the Caribbean, or in Latin America, it was just horrific, absolutely horrible. Here's a photograph, a famous photograph of the back of a slave and the lashings that he endured. On top of that, there's horrific sexual abuse. So this man, Thomas Thistlewood, he kept a journal, and he was actually a very educated man. He was from England, and he went and settled in Jamaica and had a colony there of slaves that worked his plantation. And because he happened to record in his journal what happened, we know, and you can read his journal online, that he raped 138 slaves in his life on 3,852 occasions. And this individual was actually probably one of the better ones because he was more educated, more sophisticated. If you read his journal, he was very, very thoughtful, very well read. He loved the classics. And yet you read in his journal him describe this with such casual justification. It's just horrific. We know that the laws in the United States were geared at making it a horrible crime for a black man to have intercourse with a white woman, but explicitly that was not written in the other way around. It was just horrible. And you read contemporary accounts of how slaves handled that, you can imagine the psychological abuse that they endured. On top of that, there was always the threat of family division. This is a comic, or not a comic, a drawing, a rendition of what happened in the 1800s. And this breaks my heart personally. So you can see here, there's a man who's purchasing the slave. He's the father here. And you can see his wife, his mother, just the mother of this baby pleading. You can see down at the bottom, "Buy us too." And she's just, "Oh, please take us too," because obviously she doesn't want to be separated from her husband. So you look at these things and you think, wow, what kind of horrible psychological damage would this do? Okay, so of course slavery ends in the 1860s. And I've heard this so many times from, I would say, especially individualists. They say, well, like, hey, look at where we are today in 2020. It's over, right? Like, this happened way, way long ago, right? 1860s. What are we supposed to do with this now? So it's very interesting when you look in the Bible as what is supposed to happen, biblically when slavery ends. So this is from Deuteronomy. I'll just read this. It says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year, you shall let him go free from you. So notice how in the Old Testament, whatever their notion of slavery was, it was capped at 6 years. So it was fixed. But notice what's very interesting. What happens in verse 13? It says, and when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. It says, you shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. So what is this? So it's saying that when you send your slaves away, you're supposed to bless this slave with liberal possessions from your flock, threshing floor, winepress. It's supposed to be an opportunity for a true new life ahead. And very interesting, it continues by saying, from what the Lord your God has blessed you with, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. So it's basically saying, hey, Israelites, remember, you were once slaves. You gotta treat these slaves well. Now, what was supposed to happen after emancipation in the 1860s was, 50 acres and a mule, right? That was the dream that was initially sold. But what happened, unfortunately, was very, very different. So I'm going to tell you the story here of this individual. You probably don't know him, but he was the governor of South Carolina. His name is Benjamin Tillman from 1890 to 1894. And he was senator after that in the United States Senate from 1895 to 1918. And he says, we of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed him to be the equal of the white man, and we will not submit to his gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him. So here's a public justification of lynching from a governor of a state, a senator in the United States. And this began a whole era of vicious oppression. I could talk about this a long time, but basically what was supposed to happen was people were supposed to be getting farmland, the ability to start a new life, but unfortunately laws were used in very careful ways, such, for example, unemployment laws. If you didn't have a job, you could be put in jail, and often these people blacks would be put in jail, and then they'd be forced to work on plantations again without the promise of ever gaining land. And the slightest infractions would often be met with vicious beatings, and then perceived true crimes would be met with lynchings. So just to give you a sense of scale here, between 1882 and 1968, over 3,400 blacks were lynched. And these were often public spectacles and intended to be public spectacles with thousands of individuals watching. So this is a famous picture. I'm sure many of you have seen this, of a lynching. This was from the 20th century, the early 20th century. They would often do these on churches or right in the front of the church as a way to assemble more people and to communicate symbols of authority here. And you can even see some people grinning here. You can see obviously there's children in this picture. It wasn't just men who were subject to this. This is a woman named Laura Nelson who was lynched and hung. Just catastrophic stories here of horrible, horrible oppression. There's many stories of these. There's obviously over 3,000 of these, but what's particularly heinous when you read the accounts of people who were there, these are not blacks, but people who were there, was how much they were intended to communicate just pain, inferiority, and torture. So just to give one example of this, there was a couple whose names, there were Luther and Mary Holbert, and we don't know all the details of what exactly happened there. There was some kind of love triangle going on, and in this love triangle, the slave owner tried to intervene, and he ended up being killed. And under suspicion of that, the couple decided they were lynched, but they decided to wait until Sunday. And why did they want to wait till Sunday? So that they could do it at church. So they did it at church. There was about 1,000 people there. And keep in mind, this is like calculated. This is not some horrible thing, some spontaneous thing. This is calculated. This is horrible. And what they first did was they cut off each of the fingers and toes of the victims and gave them out as souvenirs. They beat the bodies of the man and the woman so much that the man, Luther, his eyes were dangling from their sockets. And they used corkscrews to tear out flesh from the individuals. And then to make it worse, they wanted to burn the woman first so that Luther would see his beloved burn, and then they killed him. So again, these are not isolated instances. These happened for decades across thousands of people. Absolutely horrific. Okay. So then we move into the era of what's called, typically called Jim Crow. And Jim Crow, for those who know what that means, it basically means separate but equal. And it's really, of course, it's not equal, but the tagline is separate but equal. And for those who want to read about this, this is a secular book by Richard Rothstein. I've heard him lecture before. He documents very, very studiously, and I think very convincingly, that there was a whole bunch of laws that were put on the books, particularly from lending agencies, that made housing homogeneous. So basically, every city in America today has sections of primarily blacks living in those communities. And those were really the products of policies that were engineered in the middle of the 20th century. And if you want to know more about that, you can read very careful documentation, and I think you'll be completely convinced by it. As I said, it's a secular book, so I don't treat it as a Christian treatise here, but it's documented very carefully. And then you have these now pockets of, I should also say that these areas there, these neighborhoods, were much less resourced, poor schools, lots of problems there. The best jobs were, of course, not there. And so you had this widening divide that happened as a result of this housing. Then you had the era of harsh criminal sentencing. This is a person that I've had the opportunity to meet. He's unfortunately passed away. He was a professor at Harvard Law School, very brilliant man. His name William Stuntz. If you want to read about this, he was a Christian evangelical. And he documents how, well, now you've got all this problem of low income and brooding crime as a result of that. And now you have this on top of that harsh harsh sentencing that happens from the criminal justice system. Okay, so you start to put all these things together, and I wish I had more time to articulate the structuralist thesis, because there is much more I could say about it. But basically, when the 1960s come, when the civil rights movement happens, people think, okay, great, everyone's free. But the problem is you have this long legacy now. And the basic thesis here of the structuralist position is that cultures have momentum. And what I mean by that is that if you are educated, your children are probably going to be educated too. right? Education begets education. Wealth begets wealth. If you're wealthy, your children are probably going to be wealthy too. Fatherlessness begets fatherlessness. If you don't have a dad, you're probably not going to be a great dad yourself. Crime begets crime, right? I mean, these are pretty obvious statements, but when you think about this in the light of the structuralist position, what does it mean? It means that if you take a community that has had very little access to education, to wealth, they've been systematically repressed with regard to accumulation of wealth with housing, tremendous problems that have been accumulating over the generations. What a shock that when the civil rights movement happened, liberty is really, in the words of a Black author, liberty itself is really nothing. It's just a blank. It's what you make of it. But if you were a janitor before and now you're in the 1970s, how are you suddenly going to get access to those higher levels of education and wealth? You're probably not. And the structuralists would say that telling people to make better choices is laughably simple. The structuralists would say you are far more shaped by your parents, your schools, and your culture than you know. And they would say that if you just pay attention and look at how people are, you'll see they're products of their environment. And cultures have this inherent momentum. They have this inherent force to them that's very difficult to change. Okay, now we're going to switch to the individualist position here. Again, I wish I had a lot more time to unpack the structuralist argument, but we don't. And I'm going to spend a little bit shorter time on this because I think most of you are familiar with these arguments. The individualist position is basically one that usually starts in Ezekiel 18. And Ezekiel 18 is a passage that, if you go and read that, it says there that the children will not be held guilty for the sins of their father. And basically, God will judge everybody on their own basis. And that you should not be quoting in Ezekiel, if you remember the proverb where they're saying, the fathers have eaten the sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. So God there says, don't quote that anymore because I'm going to judge every person on their own basis, him or her alone. You don't need to blame prior generations. And again, I think, to reiterate my thesis here, I don't actually think this conflicts in any way with the structuralist position. We have to own them both. Of course, judgment occurs at the individual level. There's many passages in the Bible that teach that. And the individualist also says that humans can transcend difficult circumstances. They say, hey, look in the Bible, lots of people overcame the pull of their group. Therefore, we shouldn't just resign people who are in a culture that might have some problems. We should be encouraging and positive. This is a little bit more on the individual position. The individualists assert that the structuralist language can produce victimhood if taken too far. This is from an African-American author named Shelby Steele, who's, I think, one of the top authors in the field today. And he says this, he's criticizing a woman named Maureen Dowd, who's a columnist for the New York Times. And he says this, Dowd illustrates the great internal contradiction of white liberalism, that its paternalism, its focus on whites rather than on blacks as the agents of change, allows white supremacy to slip in the back door and once again define the fundamental relationship between blacks and whites. So the very structure of the liberal faith that whites and society, in quotes, must facilitate black uplift, lock white liberals into an unexamined white supremacy. They can't really believe in blacks, but they must believe in whites. Whites are the agents, blacks are the agented. Shelby Steele is at Stanford. Again, he's a very brilliant writer who, I don't think he would use the term individualist, but I would put him in that category. He's exceptionally articulate and lucid in his understandings there. Individuals also point out things like, they'll say, hey, black on black violence or black on white violence is underplayed by the media. They point out that there's certain subjects that are taboo to discuss from the structuralist side. They point out that incredible gains have been made in the last 40 to 50 years, and I think that's hard to deny. And now there is much more opportunity. And they would also say that while it's not perfect, America's a lot better off than other countries. I'm ethnically Indian, and in India they have this caste system that is horrible, and people there are suffering tremendously under a caste system that's much more pervasive in India than people appreciate there. So, you know, there's a lot of this kind of hatred of the West type mentality that individualists point out, and they say, well, is it any better in other places? And maybe is this more of a human-wide condition and not something that's uniquely an American problem? I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical perspective, much briefer though. So here's a quote. There is a certain class of race problem solvers who don't want the patient to get well because as long as the disease holds out, they have not only an easy means of making a living, but also an easy medium through which to make themselves prominent before the public. Okay, so if I ask you to guess who gave this quote, you'd be surprised. It's Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington was 9 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. And he became a very prominent leader in the Black community and was a great businessman, led communities there upward. And he bemoaned, this was in the early 20th century, this group of people that almost reveled in this kind of setting up of these dichotomies and don't want the patient to get better. They almost seem to promote policies that propagate the problem. He also picked on his own community, so he was not just one-sided. He said there's a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they're able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. So if you don't know Booker T. Washington, another author that is worth reading and exploring, who I would say is much more on that individualist perspective. These are, I would say, the two top individualists today. So we have Shelby Steele and Thomas Sowell. Actually, they're both at Stanford. I quoted from Steele earlier. He's on the right, and Thomas Sowell is on the left. They're both African-American writers. And if you want a well-written defense of the positions, I would encourage you to read their books there. And they're very, I think it's on the one hand sympathetic, but on the other hand, very, very lucid and trying to pull everyone forward too. Shelby Steele in particular has made the case that the modern approach to race relations has made both sides worse. And if you want to read that and read about his diagnosis and prescription, I would encourage you to do that. Okay, I show that slide. All right, is there racism today? So I'm going to give a few experiences here, because a lot of people I hear like, is there really racism today? You know, what's it like? And I'm just going to give a little bit of a personal perspective on this, not too much. So I was born in California, in LA, and I was a product of the public schools. I was all in public schools all the way through the end of high school. And I can remember growing up in LA getting so many racial slurs thrown my way, especially in school. And there were 4 years in particular, for me at least, that were extremely difficult, where I would get lots of ridicule for the color of my skin. Many people, at least where I lived, there weren't Indians there, and so they thought I was something like black. I didn't quite look black, and so I would get called the N-word a lot. I remember there was this one time I was sitting in school, and I just put my head down on my desk and I sobbed. I couldn't take it anymore because I was so tired of all the racist names, and I had been called that day. I remember being called the N-word, and it was a rough time. I'm actually thankful for it now in hindsight, because it gave me an ability to empathize with people who have had much worse than I have. And so I had that, and thankfully I had very strong family. I remember with my dad, we would drive around in various places, and again, people would yell racist slurs at us because of the color of our skin. And my dad was always so tough and so gritty about it. It never seemed to faze him, and that made a huge impact on me. And so we had those experiences. I had those experiences growing up. Like I said, it was difficult, but at the same time, I'm thankful for it. Ended up spending a lot of my life in the evangelical churches, and there is so much, I will say, there's a lot of racism in those settings as well. I'm not trying to paint a broad brush, because this comes from just different pockets, but it's interesting when you have this experience as a person of color living in these settings, because you can see it and you can hear it probably much more acutely than others do. And just to give a little more recent example, I don't know how many of you paid attention to this, but President Trump, when he was not president before that, he stirred up this whole controversy about Obama not being born in the U.S. and being a closet Muslim, and in very subtle ways was to me at least, saying things that you would never say about a person who was white, right? Is he going to do that with Biden coming up in the debates? He's not going to do that with Biden. And you can hear, if you listen to these subtle jabs that come from people who, in this case, is the most powerful person on the planet, probably, President Trump. In Anabaptist churches, so I'm not going to just say it's isolated to evangelicals, have had several experiences in these communities as well. I'll tell you one story. I was in one church, I won't say the name of the church, and there was a pretty well-known bishop in the church who came up to me, and he figured out I was Indian, and he walked up to me and said, "You people in India eat with your hands, right?" And I said, "Yeah, they do eat with their hands." And he just gave out this big belly laugh, and he walked away like that was just some kind of animal-like practice. And I remember thinking, I would never come back to this church if I didn't have a deep commitment to other truths. It was very, very sad. And again, I'm not going to name the church or the organization, but it's there. And there's a good number of people who still hold these ideas. As a husband, Laura and I were talking about this story the other day. Laura and I were at a post office in Massachusetts, right? In liberal Northeast Massachusetts. And she was wearing her head covering, and a man yelled at her, "Go back to your own country." Now, I don't know if he said that to her because she was with me and I'm obviously dark skinned, but doing nothing, didn't interact with him, just parking lot interaction. He was just an angry person who yelled, "Go back to your own country." Again, this combination of the head covering and me being dark skinned probably played into that. And I've had enough of these experiences to say over the years that there are significant elements that are out there. And again, it's not all people, there's a lot of great people out there, but it's hard to deny that there's at least not elements there. This week, I kid you not, this week I was reading this Bible story to my children. This is a Bible story book that somebody gave to us, and we were going through this story, and I looked at this picture. It's a picture you can't tell here, but it's a picture of Mary Magdalene washing Jesus's feet. That's her head down here. And I looked at this and I thought, this is a really disturbing picture. So of course, Jesus has blonde hair in this, and the disciples look a little bit more Middle Eastern. And then the depiction of the servant, some kind of black man there who doesn't look particularly attractive. I thought, like, wow, this isn't a Bible story book that people are supposed to read to their children. Not good. When standards divide ethnic lines, the very first book that I ever preached through exegetically was the book of Galatians. This was many years ago, maybe 15 years ago or so. And I went through this book, and it was an eye-opening experience for me, because when I went through that book, I realized how big of a deal these ethnic questions really are in the mind of the Apostle Paul. So much of the New Testament is trying to forge a unity between Jew and Gentile. And Gentile is all the other nations that are out there. And of course, the book of Galatians is about circumcision. And when you read that book, he makes this argument that there are these stoikia to kosmou in Greek, these elemental spirits that are trying to divide humanity. And he basically says in this book that if you put yourself under circumcision, you are going to be subject to these elemental spirits that are all about dividing and separating. And he makes these beautiful arguments, these fantastic arguments all throughout the book, that you can't add to Scripture, because when you add to Scripture, it's going to tear apart your group. And so these statements in Galatians 3 about there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, they're set in that context of Paul trying to achieve ethnic unity and specifically attacking an extra biblical standard here. I was in an Anabaptist church, and I was looking at their standards. I think I have a copy somewhere in my office here. And I pointed this out actually to one of the church leaders, and I was looking through it, and it said that the women were required to wear black hose because we can't have the color of flesh showing. And I thought to myself, what are you doing? That is so just implicitly wrong. And it didn't bother him. It bothered me that it didn't bother him. But I thought, you're writing into your church standards that the default color of flesh must be white, because that's why you're saying to wear these black stockings. People don't understand why I get so passionate about this question of extra biblical standards. I've written about this in my book, but it's partly because these divide. And the more you go into this realm, the more monolithic ethnically you're going to be. and the more you're going to undercut the very purpose of what Paul is trying to do in Galatians, which is to forge this unity of the people of God. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about solutions here. I realize my talk is on the longer side, so bear with me here. There's a common trap, which is, I think, to commonly look for something to do that the world will celebrate and pat you on the back for, right? I think all of us feel this pressure right now. You feel this sense of like, oh, this is in the news all the time. We got to do something so that people like us and that they see that we're on the good side. But I can tell you right now, you're probably not going to be on CNN or the New York Times for following God's ways of reconciliation. And the sooner that we embrace that, and the sooner we realize that God's ways of operating, they're just different. And the world in general is not going to appreciate them, at least in the moment. And what I want to do here is I want to give two broad perspectives on activism. This is a very, very useful framework for you to understand activism. This ideas come from a theologian named Christopher Little. And what he says is that there's two basic positions. The two positions are, one, holism, and the other one is priorism. Okay, so holism and priorism. So what are these two? So holism basically says that there's this whole world of activities out there. So clean water, legal justice, feeding the poor, church planting, evangelism, all that, and they're all kind of on the same plane. They're all flat. The person who advocates for a priorist position would say those are all good things, but the very top of our priorities, the most important priorities, should be evangelism, discipleship, church planting, because out of that can flow all of the other activities. So it's a long-standing critique of those who hold holism, which are usually mainline denominations. So think about like liberal Presbyterian churches, places like that, where they'll be really excited about, building a clean water well or something like that. And hey, that's a great thing, right? We'd all agree on that. But it's been pointed out that you rarely, if ever, take a group of people that are committed to clean water and say, now let's go out and evangelize. They're going to look at you and say, what in the world? Whereas those who are priorists, that happens all the time, where they're there in a community and they recognize the priority of eternal salvation, but yet out of that still flows let's call it the humanitarian perspectives. Now, Bible-believing Christians have historically nearly all been advocates of priorism. They say that these are all good things, but our main activity that we can't lose sight of is to win the lost of all ethnicities. Okay, so I'm an unapologetic priorist, and I stand in the tradition of certainly the vast majority of the history of church. Not at all saying that those activities aren't important, but that they're not at the same level as evangelism and discipleship. Okay, so what should we do today? So I'm going to throw out this list here and then give some discussion questions for our group. What can we really do today that's practical, that's real, that's true to the Bible, that integrates all of this together? So the first is be sensitive to racism. Don't put someone on a pedestal and don't look down on people. There's differing errors that I see people fall into where, if you're a person of color, all of a sudden you're like privileged in some way and other people look down on you. It's like there's this weird polarization that can happen there where you're not just a regular human being. We don't want to do that either one. We want to treat people as people and not fall into either error there. And we want to be diligent to understand the issue. So I really feel like one of the main problems is the shallowness of the news and social media. You can't really get much substance in an article or a soundbite or even a 30-minute, 60-minute podcast. You really got to start with books and have rich discussions from that. I will say that having listened to a little bit of the content that's been generated out there, not a little bit, a lot, in the last 2 months, the vast majority of it is so shallow that it doesn't really incorporate the depth of these positions, the structuralist position or the individualist position. And unless you're really willing to engage in some reading and some work here, you shouldn't talk, or at least shouldn't have strong opinions. Number 3 is believe other stories. It says in 1 Corinthians 13 that love believes all things, right? Hopes all things, believes all things. And So many people don't believe that there's racism out there when there's so many people who will credibly attest to it. We in general have to give the benefit of the doubt. When there's somebody who you know who's standing across from you and they're telling their story, we should believe that. We should take it at face value. And again, I think often there's a temptation to disregard that and to not believe it. All right, next one, B, and what I mean by B is live and work in places of multiple ethnicities. So you all know what a big champion I am of being in the city. I've written about this, I've spoken about this on many occasions. This is one of the great reasons to live in a city, right? Is that we get to be in contact with lots and lots of people of all different ethnic groups. And I love being in Boston with such rich cultural diversity here. I work with people who are African American, who are Asian, who are Hispanic. It's great. And it's very hard to change things or to be affixed to this if you live in a very rural setting where you're just around homogeneous populations there. You're probably not going to make much of an impact on this. Make the church a place of deep, patient, and listening discussion. That would be magnetic. As I said, I've been very turned off by how shallow the typical discussions are that you hear in the news. I actually think that if there even were just a forum, even if there was a great place for true depth and true listening, where you can really get both sides, and it's at the level of thought that you would find, say, in a book, that would be magnetic. It would be just amazing. And I think a lot of people would start listening and paying attention just to know that there's serious thought going on and not just sound bites and gotchas and really quick vignettes that accomplish almost nothing. Work hard for unity. Don't let the devil cause division in the church. I mentioned this from the beginning, that it seems like the church has done a poor job at being divided over these issues. And what we ought to do is be very vigilant to the fact that, just like in the book of Galatians, this is intended to divide. This whole issue for thousands of years has been something that the devil has used very, very well to divide. I truly believe that if people were willing to read together, to have deep thought together, to really engage, there would be a surprising amount of unity. But most people don't make the time. Most people don't make those spaces for the time or the discussion to have those conversations and to put in the work. Be active in evangelism and discipleship in those places. And those places is the places of multiple ethnicities. Working at the Bridge, I love teaching at the Bridge there. That's one of the most radical things you can do, where you're serving a multi-ethnic community, you're doing evangelism, you're having people in your home, you're doing that great thing. I'm going to put another bullet on here, which I didn't write down, which is let your actions be more dominant than your words. There's too many people who are talking and not enough people who are doing. If you really want to be committed to this issue, let your words be reflective of a prior commitment that's exhibited in your life to being successful in evangelism and discipleship in multi-ethnic communities. Also, maybe give a little bit of a bellwether here that your rhetoric, your dialogue, however you speak, this is a great test to use, okay? So let's think about Jesus. One of the things I love about Jesus is that he drew together people of such different persuasions. So he had zealots who wanted to completely overthrow the system. And then he also had tax collectors that were part of the system and that were profiting from the system. And then he had prostitutes who were disenfranchised people that nobody wanted to regard. He had all three of those groups around him at the same time. And I think it's the mark of a person who can speak well and understands the stories and the narratives of these different camps that can be attractive to all of them. If you are just hanging out with one type or the other type, you're probably imbalanced and you're not showing that same attractive capacity that Jesus had to people of multiple persuasions. And I really want to encourage all of you to ask yourself, like, who am I attracting? Who am I repelling? That's a good sign that you probably aren't yet where you need to be like Jesus in understanding people where there are and understanding their narratives, however incomplete they may be. All right, my last slide, then I'll put up discussion questions here. Cause for hope. This year, 2020, has been an unbelievable year. I mean, just unbelievable. If you had thought, if somebody had given a talk on January 1st, 2020, here you're going to be in July, midway through the year, all sporting events are going to be shut down. People are all going to be working from home. You're going to be wearing masks most of the time when you're out there with people. There's going to be a huge economic wave of devastation that people would have thought you were crazy. Nobody would have believed you. And here we are 6 months later, and we're living this out. Oh, and by the way, there's going to be rioting. There's going to be an autonomous zone in Seattle that at least partly is its own country. There's going to be this wave of revolution that seemingly is spreading over the country. People would be completely disbelieving that. It's obviously happened. And many people, and some writers that I follow in particular, have made a really interesting case that there's a great analogy between this year, 2020, and 1968. So 1968 was the year that MLK, JFK were assassinated, civil rights was brewing, Vietnam War. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in that year. Tremendous disconnect, tremendous turnover. And I think that this year, 2020, is very, very analogous to 1968. Again, we can't explore this too much now, but there's a lot of great analogies. But what's so interesting about 1968 is that that was the setup for something amazing. And those who know your history know that after that came the Jesus movement, renewed evangelism, a new commitment to missions, and many positive developments. I truly believe that if we are wise in this time, and if we process together, then we can similarly have this year not be cause for despondency, but as a launch pad into something that hopefully will be an amazing movement where the church can come out ahead and as a leader in practice and in thought on how to do real reconciliation, biblical reconciliation, and to live out Jesus' mandate of blessed are the peacemakers. All right, so with that, I have some questions here for us to discuss. Is your natural inclination individualism or structuralism, and why? And be honest with this. Hey, we're going to do this in our own congregations, so we're going to have open conversations. You don't need to feel shy about this. It's not recorded. Have you observed racism? If not, how would you figure out if there really is racism? What resources have you found or read that have been helpful? I gave some in my talk here. I have a bunch more if you want some recommendations from me. How can you promote unity in the church on this topic? And then finally, what practical steps can you take to live out the gospel in a multi-ethnic setting? All right, so these are my 5 questions. If you want to take a screenshot of it, now's the time to do it. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Clark after I pray. And I want us to seriously discuss these questions, like I said, in our own congregations. For those who don't know what group you're supposed to be in, I trust that Clark has a good system there, and I hope he's got something lined up. So I'm going to close this out in prayer, and then we'll go into our breakout rooms. Father in heaven, I will say that my heart is heavy when I think about the tremendous burden and the tremendous oppression that the African American population in particular, that's been generationally here, has endured. And I think about these grievances, and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to see the transportation and the treatment and the violence and the sexual exploitation and the legal wranglings and all of this that has been now centuries of very difficult living. And I believe that Jesus also is filled with compassion because of the many centuries of oppression. We also, Father, know that you are a God of hope and that people change one by one, and that there are many elements of truth in the individualist perspective. And I pray that we can see these not as opposed, but as synergized, that we can own this tension, we can understand it and not divide over it. I pray that we in the church would see the devil's traps from thousands of years ago, how he loves to divide people over these issues. And I pray that instead we would be able to display a maturity and a patience and a gentleness and a wisdom that is astonishing for how well read we are, how thoughtful we are, how we can appreciate the different perspectives that are out there, and how we can integrate those under the banner of Jesus, who has come to make one people out of the many divided nations of the world. We thank you that Jesus is our King, and that we live under a great nation, a nation that is well governed. We praise you, Jesus, for your equity, for your righteousness. And I pray that in this discussion time that we're going to have, that you will help us to be just open and honest and to contribute well to solutions. I pray that we would be faithful at the practice of evangelism and discipleship, that we'd be known for having homes filled with multi-ethnic visitors, great conversations, great Bible studies with people from every tongue, every tribe, every nation, as we go out and fulfill the Great Commission. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.